Okay, so we are recording now. So we have Catherine Grant here. She's going to be talking about English church records, understanding the basics. And I'm just going to do a quick bio once again for you. She has taught many webinars for the BYU History Library, has written blog posts for for Family Search, and has done research videos for the Family History Guide. So we are excited for you to present tonight. So we will just give it to you now.
Great. Christy, thank you so much. And everybody, I am so excited to be with you tonight. I love this topic. It's actually one of my very favorites, just because English church records have played such a large part in my own family history. And I'm guessing that if you're attending this tonight, probably you've got an interest in church records as well in England. So I hope this will be helpful to you. So let's take a look at what we'll be covering in the class tonight. First of all, I wanted to be really clear about the scope of the webinar, just so you know what to expect. And then we'll talk about some key dates related to English church records. We'll give you some examples of church records and what to expect on each type of record. And then finally, the funnest part and kind of where the rubber hits the road, we'll actually talk through several examples where church records helped answer research questions. And then finally, we'll tell you some places where you can find these amazing records. Okay, to be clear about the scope of today's webinar, tonight's class, in scope are Church of England parish registers, which include baptisms, banns of marriage, marriages, and burials. And then also Church of England bishops' transcripts, nonconformist registers, and out of scope, we are not going to talk about other church records, such as poor law settlement and removal, vestry records, and so forth. The reason that we're not going to cover those tonight is that these topics will take up the full class time, and we didn't want to keep you here forever. And so maybe sometime we'll do another webinar on these other types of records, but the ones that we're covering are the ones that will be the most useful to you. Okay, so let's look at some key dates in relation to English church records. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the story of Henry VIII starting his own church. And the reason he did that was that he wanted to divorce his wife. She wasn't producing the heir that he wanted. And so he was a Catholic at the time and asked the Pope for permission to divorce his wife. And the Pope said no. And Henry was not very happy about that. So he said, well, forget you, Pope, I'm starting my own church. And he did. And that became the Church of England. About 4 years later, I can subtract, right? 34 to 38. About 4 years later, King Henry actually did a wonderful thing for family historians. And that is that he mandated that the Church of England keep records, parish registers of baptisms, marriages, and burials. In 1598, so that would be what, about 60 years later, the mandate was given for parishes to make a copy of their records. Now that you can, to us, that may not sound like a big deal, but think about having to copy everything, thousands and thousands of records by hand. So there's no electronic means of copying. There's not even, in the old days, if we had mimeograph machines and whatever, there was nothing. You copied it by hand. But the reason they did that was because there was a risk of the records being destroyed if there was only one copy. I mean, rats could eat them. They could mildew. They could just disintegrate over time. There could be a fire, all kinds of reasons. And so this was actually a very wise thing to require the parishes to have somebody copy their records. So they kept a copy, and then another copy was sent into the archdeacon or to the bishops, and hence the name of bishops' transcripts or BTs. So essentially, in many cases, it's not 100% guaranteed, but in many, many cases, you'll have two copies of those parish registers. Okay, fast forward to 1754, when there was concern in England about what were called clandestine marriages, or what we might call also invalid marriages. So for instance, an invalid marriage would be if somebody was married to somebody else and one of the partners didn't know it, or there were sometimes questions if somebody ran away to Scotland to get married, was that a valid marriage? Or if they went down to Fleet Prison and got a quick marriage, was that valid. And so Lord Hardwicke was the one who pushed this act into Parliament and said, you know, we've got to clamp down on this. We've got to make sure that certain not really policies, but I guess canons of the church are followed. So they put all that in place. But one of the things that they put in place, which is particularly of interest to us as genealogists, is that they required printed forms for marriages and banns. Makes it so much easier and standardizes the information. And then in 1813, they decided to mandate printed forms for all parish registers. So births, marriages, and burials all began to use printed forms. And again, that's such a boon to genealogists because the information is more consistent and more readable. And then finally, in 1837, civil registration begins. And if you're not familiar with civil registration, it's just the reporting of vital events to a government authority. And so in 1837, starting in July of that year, the government required the reporting of births, marriages, and deaths. The reason that, and so it's not a church record. And so you might be saying, well, why are you mentioning civil registration? And the reason is that as of 1837, July 1837, you've got two copies of vital records. So you've got the government copy and you've got the church copy. And that is such a great thing if, for instance, the church record is unreadable or contradictory or something like that, then you know that you've got access to the government copy of that or version of that vital event as well. Now, it's important to note that not everybody agreed with King Henry VIII starting his own church. And those who didn't agree actually had to have a lot of courage. So if you run across ancestors that were what they called nonconformists because they didn't conform to the Church of England, then you can know that your ancestors were very courageous and recognized that in many cases, I've had the feeling they recognized that the gospel as taught in the Bible was not on the earth at that time, and definitely not in the Church of England, which had broken away from the Catholic Church. So there were other churches such as Baptists, Methodists, and anybody who didn't conform to the Church of England generally went by the designation of nonconformist. Well, I should say they didn't choose to go by that designation, but that's what they were called popularly, was nonconformist because they didn't conform. The genealogically relevant thing about that is that they kept separate records. So if your ancestors didn't belong to the Church of England, then you know that you would need to search these other nonconformist records. Okay, so that's a little background. Let's look now at some examples of church records of each of the types and what you can expect. I did want to list a couple of caveats here, and that is that the examples are representative, but there's always going to be exceptions. So they're not hard and fast rules. So here is our first example. This is a baptism before printed forms started to be used. And so you'll see some variations. You know, clergymen might list things in different order, or some would include occupations and others wouldn't, and so forth. But usually you can count on at least seeing the name of the child, the baptism date, and the father's name. And very often the mother's name was included too, but not always. And because these are a little bit difficult to read, I'm always putting a transcription down at the bottom of the page so that you can tell what the highlighted part says. So this is just a record that on June 23rd, William, the son of Francis and Winifred Bescaby, was christened. Okay, this is an example of a baptism on a printed form that started in 1813. And you can see that this is a big improvement over the just free handwritten forms. So let's just walk through. I know this is a little bit small, so we'll walk through this and see what we can find on a baptism or christening form. So the first thing, as you might expect, is the baptism date. Then we've got the name of the child. First and middle names are in this column. Then you've got the first names of the parents in the next column and their surname after that. Then you've got the abode of the family, which can be incredibly helpful if you're trying to coordinate baptism records and, for example, census records, or maybe a burial record for a child, because you can tell where that family lived. And it isn't always the place where the child was christened. Sometimes it's a nearby parish or a hamlet or some little area that's close by but doesn't have the same name. The next thing I love is that it was standard for them to ask for occupations. And that's also helpful in telling if if you're matching, say, the right father in a census to the right father in a baptism record. At the end, we've got the clergyman, the name of the clergyman who performed the ceremony. But look at what we've got here too. We've got a bonus. When I get up to heaven, I am going to, if I make it there, I'm going to hug this clergyman, because look what he did. He did not have to do this, and he wrote the birth date of the child in the margin. There wasn't a column for it, and he took it upon himself, maybe through inspiration, to record this extra information. So this actually is a good time to put in a plug for always checking the image if it's available, because the image may have information on it that hasn't been indexed. I did want to point out a couple of other things that you might see on christening records that initially they were puzzling to me. I didn't know what they were. So here's an example. You notice this PB in the margin. PB stands for private baptism, or sometimes you would just see the word private. And this was done, sadly, if the child was sickly and unlikely to survive. And at that time, I'm actually not sure of the current canon of the Church of England, but I know at that time it was thought that if you did not have your child baptized, then when they died, they would be kind of in this limbo state, as I understand it. So it wasn't really hell, but it also wasn't heaven. And so parents were very strongly motivated to have their children baptized before, especially if there was any danger of that child dying. And so they'd call the clergyman, and the clergyman would come to the house in many instances and perform that ceremony. So the reason this is genealogically significant is that if you see it, you know that it's very likely that you'll be looking for a burial record of that child pretty soon after this christening takes place. Now, that's not always the case. There are times, I remember one person on my line who was privately baptized, but fortunately for the family and for him, he recovered and grew up and got married. And so he had posterity that we could add to our family tree. But many times this private baptism means that the child died not too long afterward. This one, I just wanted to point out that this dear clergyman, it's a different one, as you can see from the name, but he also took it upon himself to write the birth date. He did it in the first column, and he just split the cell here, split the table cell, and he put the christening date on the top, and then he put born and put the date the child was born. So this is amazing. Again, a plug for looking at the image, because you may get information on there that has not been indexed. Here's another interesting thing that you might see on a baptism record. So Church of England baptisms were performed for infants, but there were exceptions. Notice on this one that it notes that this Lavinia Schofield was christened or baptized when she was 15 years old. And I'll tell you, I did not look at the image the first time I found this. I just looked at the index, and I went crazy trying to find Lavinia based on thinking that her christening date in 71 was her birth date, and it wasn't. And then when I finally looked at the image and noticed that she was baptized as a teenager, then I could calculate the right birth date. Then I was just able to find her immediately. So again, a plug for looking at the image anytime that you can. And a little comment about that is that sometimes one site will not have the image, they'll only have the index. For instance, maybe Family Search Historical Records only has an index, no images. But you pop over to Ancestry or Find My Past, and they do have the images. So if one site doesn't have an image, I would always recommend checking the other sites that are likely, or that it may be possible that they'll have the same image, because so many of the major sites have the same record collections. Okay, that was baptisms. Let's talk about bands. In case you're not familiar with bands, because many of us aren't, this is not practiced in most religions that I am aware of today. It may still be practiced in the Church of England. I'm actually not up on common practices of the church, just like 1800s practices. But like my Catholic friends, I'm not aware of them having bans for marriage. But so for that reason, I wanted to explain a little bit what bans are. They are the proclamation of the intention of two people to marry. So the intent of requiring bans, and this actually was one of the things required by Lord Hardwicke's Act, it was to prevent invalid marriages. And so what would happen is that the bans were read, or sometimes they say called or published, in the church at the home parish of the bride and the groom on 3 successive Sundays. So it was basically the Church of England version of, if anybody knows any reason why this couple may not be lawfully joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. So the congregation had 3 weeks to say, hey, wait a minute, Fred Jones over in that other parish, I know his wife, he's already married. So yeah, this marriage would not be valid. So people could protest the marriage if they knew some reason that it should not take place. And bans, but everybody didn't have to do bans. If you were willing to pay enough money, you could actually get a license and you could avoid the bans. So myths about bans. There are a couple that I want to mention. One is that if the bans were published or called, that the couple definitely got married. And that is not the case. Just like engagements nowadays, there's times when one or the other calls it off. And so we can't conclude that just because we find a record of bans that the couple was definitely married. Closely related to that, I remember talking with a teacher actually who had been told that the third band's date was always the marriage date. And when I heard that, I thought that doesn't seem right, but I better check into it just in case, that it happens sometime. So I actually checked with some very skilled English researchers to verify, and they said no, the band's date, you cannot count on the third band's date being the marriage date. And honestly, in all the years I've been doing English research since, which is, oh gosh, like 15 or 20 years, I have never seen a marriage take place on the date of the third bands. That's not to say it couldn't, but think it would be kind of weird to have the whole wedding planned like for immediately after the banns were read in the church ceremony. And almost always when I found a marriage record for the banns, it's like 2 or 3 days later or a week later or something like that. But it is pretty close. Like you wouldn't expect the banns to be called and then the marriage to take place like 5 years later or something. So it's usually, in my experience, just trying to think back, generally it's been, I would say, within a week or two. Okay, so those are myths. One thing I did want to point out, which actually may have given rise to this second myth, is that sometimes the indexing instructions for Family Search indexers were to put the third band date as the marriage date. So if you come across bans on Family Search, and I'm not aware of any other site that did that, they may have, but I'm not aware. So if you are using bans records, I would always check the image on that. Or if it says it's a marriage, but it's like ambiguous, it might say marriage/bans, then you would always want to check the image and be sure what type of record it was. Okay, so here's an example of a ban's record. This ban, the date that the first one here is the first date that the banns were called. And then the 3 dates that they had to do it, remember it's 3 successive Sundays, are listed here in this second column. So they did call the banns. And the banns were called for Joseph Henry Tavender and Annie Louisa Baker, I think it was Process. And then here is their residence. Well, we found this couple. A friend and I were working together on, I think this was her family actually, and we found this couple married in Family Search. And we thought, oh, good, because Joseph Henry Tavender was her relative. And so we looked and looked and looked for this family in the census. We looked for death records. We looked for immigration records. We could find nothing that indicated that this couple existed. And so then again, I'm not trying to harp on this. I actually hadn't really intended to say this, but good thing we checked the image, because this was one of those books that had a left and a right side. So this is only the left side. And when we like not scrolled, but like drug the image over to the other side, we've got, that he was a bachelor, so unmarried at the time. She was a spinster, other stuff. I think this is the name of the clergyman. And then look what happened. Somebody either got cold feet or they found out something that made the marriage not able to take place, but the banns were withdrawn. And so that's why we could never find any information about this couple being a married couple. And in fact, we later, as I recall, it was 2 or 3 years later, we found another marriage for Joseph Henry Tavender. And so he did not marry this lady, even though because of the incorrect indexing, he had been matched with her in Family Search. So again, it's always a good idea to be careful and look at the details so that we're doing accurate research. Okay, here is another example of a band's record. And I found that there are actually quite a few different types of forms, and I'm actually not sure why that is. But this is another bands of marriage form. This is between George Stokes Besceby. He's a widower, and we've got Millicent Ann Millington, his wife, and then the 3 dates that the bands were called. Now, this record, sometimes on these types of bands records, I've seen where a clergyman will just handwrite, like in diagonal across the form, they'll write marriage solemnized on such and such a date. But this one doesn't have that. So the reason I wanted to point that out again is that banns are not proof of marriage. They're strong indication that the marriage took place. Most of the time after banns were called, the marriage did, but it's not a guarantee. So if the marriage is not indicated on the banns record, in other words, it's not indicated that it was solemnized, then you're always want to look for the actual marriage record. Okay, here's a form where the band's record had a place to say that the marriage was solemnized. So the banns of marriage here were published between Francis Besceby and Winifred Rotting, both of this parish, and then it gives the 3 dates when the banns were called. And then down here, we've got that the marriage actually was solemnized. And so this does provide proof of the marriage. Okay, this is now, those were the bands, and now we're looking at actual marriage records. So this probably looks really similar to the pre-form baptism records that we showed and discussed. Again, it's just totally free form, written by the clergyman. So it again, there's basic things that were just about always included, but it did vary from parish to parish depending on what the clergyman chose to include. But usually you'll have the name of the bride and groom and the marriage date, of course. That's almost a no-brainer, right? But then it would also sometimes include the residence, the groom's occupation, the father's and the father's occupation, and whether the marriage took place by banns or by license. So here is another type of marriage form. I'll have to say this is actually one of my least favorite ones because it absolutely does not have a place for the parents. And listing at least the father, actually the other forms, English forms, don't list the mother either. But they do list the father. But this one doesn't. And so that's such a valuable piece of information to know at least one of the parents. And so that's why this is not my favorite form, but it does include the names of the bride and groom, the marriage date, the residence, and then it also does have some witnesses, which is really cool because many times the witnesses could be family members. And then sometimes they will include the marital status of the person, but not always. You notice that this person the clergyman wrote in that he was a bachelor and she was a spinster, again, meaning that they were not previously married. But I've noticed on these forms that some clergymen did not record that information. Now, this is my favorite marriage form because it has such good information on it. So let's walk through this type of marriage form and see what's available to us as family historians. So at the top, you'll find the marriage location. Then you'll get the marriage date, the bride and groom, their ages at marriage, which can be really helpful if you've only found a marriage record and then you're trying to maybe find them in a census before the marriage or something like that. One thing that you might see in this particular column is the word full. What that means is full age or age of majority. And pretty much every country in the world that I'm aware of has ages at which it becomes legal to marry without parental consent. And before that time, you have to get parental consent, and then there's usually even another age at which it's not legal to marry under that age. But if they say full age, that means they were at the legal age of majority, but it doesn't always mean they were exactly at that age. It means at least that age. So what was the age of majority in England? Well, it varied from decade to decade. It just depended on the legal requirements, the laws of majority age. And so what you would want to do if it said full here, and they were different often for men and women. Women would have a younger age of majority than men, oftentimes. And so, what you'd want to do if it just said full for both the bride and the groom, you'd want to find out what the age of majority was legally at the time of the marriage. And then we've got marital status. Notice that he is a bachelor, not previously married, but she's a widow. So she was previously married. And that's important because women would get married under their previously married name, but we're supposed to enter names in our family history programs like Family Search or Ancestral Quest or whatever under the woman's birth name to avoid confusion. So in this case, we would want to say, okay, her name is Morris here, but that's got to be the name of her previous husband's surname. And here is her father's name, which tells us her maiden name or her birth name. And I actually can't read that very well. I think we ended up saying that it was something like Tweedle. I'd have to go back to my records because I haven't looked at this for a while. So let's see, this gives the occupation of the bride and groom, their residence at the time of marriage. And this is something also to be careful of. That is, sometimes people will say, oh, residence, that must mean their birthplace, but not necessarily. For instance, somebody might have gone to London to work and then they met somebody and fell in love and got married quite a distance away from their home parish. So all this means is this is where they were living when the marriage took place. And then we've got the names of the fathers, which, as we said before, is incredibly helpful, and also the fathers' occupations. Dan, this is really fun. I love this, especially if this is your family. This can be so meaningful that you've got the signatures of the bride and groom, but not always. Sometimes, like many of my ancestors, were not literate. And so they were asked by the officiator to just write an X. And then the officiator would put their name and they would say the mark of so and so, or his mark, or her mark, or something like that. And then we've also got witnesses, which can be helpful in tracing families. And here's the part where they say whether it was by license or by bans. Okay, let's move on to burial records. Again, free-form example of a burial record before forms were used in 1813. Name of the deceased and the burial date. And often on burials in English church records, that's it. It's just the date they were buried and their name. And oftentimes they will include an age and sometimes relationships. Although I've noticed that relationships were usually just included for infants. So like on a 79-year-old woman, for example, her parents would not be included, but a 2-week-old baby, the parents would often be noted. Here's an example of the form. So we've got the name of the deceased, the residence, so name of the deceased, the abode or residence, when they were buried, and then the age. And notice that this one put a D for 2 days. And this isn't a standard thing, but it is interesting that this particular clergyman decided to do that. And if it was a year, he wrote a Y above it. So, and often they would note like infant here. They might not give an exact age, but they would say infant or child or something like that. Okay, let's talk about bishops' transcripts. As we mentioned, those were first mandated in 1598 for safety reasons, just because if you only had one copy, there was a greater chance of losing that information. They generally followed the same format as the original. In other words, if one was free form, then the other would be free form. Or if one used the printed form, the other would use the printed form as well. The ending dates for bishops' transcripts varied. Some of them actually stopped with the advent of civil registration because I'm guessing they figured that was the backup copy, but some of them went quite a bit longer than that. So you always want to check the original record if possible, because as happens with any type of copy, some bishops' transcripts contain errors. So if you'd like to learn more about bishops' transcripts, check out this article, English Bishops' Transcripts in the Family Search Wiki. And at the end of this presentation, I'll put a link to the slide deck in the chat, and you're welcome to save that link, and then you can review it and save yourself a copy if you want to, whatever would be helpful. I wanted to give an example here of why it's important to try and check the originals if you can. So I had a record that just showed up out of the blue, a burial record for, I believe his name was Thomas. It was on my Bescabie line. So I'm going to say Thomas Bescabie. And he, like, I could find nothing about him, just that he was buried. And it was a bishop's transcript. So I searched everything, you guys, like everything I could think of a way to find him, because obviously he had to be born before he was buried, right? So I was looking backwards, trying to find maybe a parent's marriage that might have had a son named Thomas and a christening record and whatever, and couldn't find anything. Then I looked at the original record, and apparently the poor copyist, which I totally have empathy for them, had mixed up 2 lines. And the date that the transcriber had said was his burial date was actually his christening date. And it turned out that he didn't die at that date. That's when he was christened, and he went on to grow up and get married. And once I found that original record, it just broke through a brick wall for me. So BTs are great, but do check the originals if at all possible. How do you tell if you're looking at a bishop's transcript? Well, in Ancestry, they will tell you, which is very handy. They'll tell you that it's the register type is the bishop's transcript. What I've noticed is if it's not a bishop's transcript, that they don't list the register type. So that's fine. If there's no register type listed, you're probably pretty safe. I mean, there's probably exceptions to everything, right? But you're pretty safe to say those are original parish registers. But if there's a register type listed of a bishop's transcript, then you know those are copies. In Family Search historical records, also, they make it easy because they put it right in the title. So if the title doesn't say bishop's transcripts, chances are very strong that you're looking at original records. If it says bishop's transcripts, then you know it's a copy. So, little audience participation here. Which one do you guys think is the BT on this? You notice these are identical records. So, I would be interested to know. And I think everybody is muted, but go ahead and put it in the chat if you want to. Say which one you think is the BT and which is the original, just top or bottom, and why. And this is off to tell you, this is really more of an art than a science. So I'm just interested to hear what people think. Yep. G Hammer, you're exactly right. The top one is a transcript. Yep, Linda, you're right. Because you notice the handwriting is a lot neater and more consistent. And then another way you can tell, like on regular copies, the handwriting won't be as consistent, and you can um oh, what I was going to say, actually, I realized I was saying it backwards. On a bishop's transcript, you may see different names of the clergymen. As they go through, maybe one clergyman died and another one was replaced, but all their names will be written in the same handwriting. And so that's another clue that you're looking at a bishop's transcript, as opposed to if they were the originals, then the clergyman would have been writing his own name and the handwriting would change when the clergyman changed. Another thing that you can note that will help you if you're comparing, especially which one is which, is notice that again, on copies, there are from time to time going to be mistakes. So in this one, we've got that Joanna Wallace died at 45 years, but notice that here the copyist did not include the years. So you'll often find, I shouldn't say often, but sometimes you will find that the original record is more complete than the bishop's transcript. So good job, you guys. Okay, let's do a little crash course on nonconformist churches. So in 1538, when Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, he established the Church of England. Also, it's called the Anglican Church, if you hear that term used. And so, as we said, some people didn't really go along with that. So those who belonged to other churches than the Church of England became known as nonconformists or even dissenters. Wait, trying to get oh, wait, sorry, you guys, I clicked that wrong. I was trying to get the thing to show up here. There we go. Okay, so nonconformist denominations included Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Society of Friends, and Latter-day Saint, and even more. But those were the most common nonconformist churches. And what is good about this for genealogists is that nonconformists kept their own church records, and a lot of times they were better than the standard Church of England records. And we're going to be looking at a few examples. If you'd like to learn more about nonconformist churches, check out this wiki article. And again, this link is live. And so when I put the link to the slides in the chat at the end, you'll be able to bring up this slide deck, come to this slide, and click on that, and it will take you over to the wiki. So here's an example. Most Church of England records do not include the mother's maiden name on the child's christening record, but very often nonconformist records will. And that is huge. For those of you who have struggled to find a mother's birth name or maiden surname, you know what an amazing blessing this is to have that information. And then also on death records. So burial records, most Church of England registers will just list the burial date, but nonconformist records may also list the death date. Not only that, they may list family relationships, which again, as we saw for Church of England, very often was not done. Okay, last thing we're going to do is go over some research examples. And my hope here is that these will help you, like give you ideas for what you can do in your own research with English church records. So the first one that I wanted to point out was that I found this marriage for John Bescaby and Sarah Elizabeth Headland. And I knew nothing about John Bescaby at that point. I mean, I knew he was family because he was from the right place and his last name was Bescaby. But other than that, I didn't know anything about his parents or where he was from. All I had was this marriage record. And so my goal was to determine, like, find a christening record for him, if at all possible. Well, here's an example of when an age wasn't given. I'm like, no, that the one time that I needed the age was the one when they didn't give it. And I have no idea why his has a dash, but hers says full. So this is a full age. So this is an example of what we were talking about earlier. So John, we have like no clue whatsoever, but because he's a widower, he had to have been at least full age. And so the only thing I could think to go on was, okay, he's been married before, possibly he's raised a family, possibly he didn't though, maybe his wife died young. So I just estimated that he would probably be between 20 and 50, but I don't really know. But that was just a range for me to start my search. Then, thank goodness, the father was listed and the occupation was listed. And tailor is a pretty unique occupation in England, at least in my family. Many of my ancestors were agricultural laborers and miners. They were the poor segment of society. So to find somebody who is a tailor is wonderful because that's an easy occupation to try and match to other records. So I would presume that his dad would be a tailor on John's christening record. So this is what I'm going to be looking for is a christening record for John Bescaby between 1793 and 1823, probably in Lincoln, because back then people didn't move around a lot. They pretty much stayed in their, excuse me, in or near their home parish. So let the search begin. So I went to one of my very favorite sites for English records, which is freereg.org.uk. It's got over 45 million transcriptions of parish registers. And what I've noticed about this site is that they are incredibly careful. So the quality of the records is very high, and they transcribe things that other indexers often don't transcribe, such as witnesses and occupations. So you can see by the highlights, these are the criteria that I entered for the search, and this is what we came up with. And to my surprise, actually, even though I put in that huge span, I only got 3 hits, and they were very close together. They were in 1818 and 1819. So here's what I found. Which one do you guys think is my guy? Yep, if you said the top one, that's the conclusion that I came to too, because it was the right father's name, the right occupation, and a reasonable birth date. So that let me start building that family, because once I knew that those records were there, that the record was there for John, and that his dad was still listed as a tailor, then I could also start looking for his siblings and build out that family tree. Okay, okay, sorry, I thought I might have skipped a slide there. Here is another example, and this is something that I actually use quite a bit, which I love, is I'll find maybe one person and then I will want to know if that person had siblings so that I can add them to the tree. And at this time in England, if Joe has siblings, probably they're close in years and in the same parish register. So here is one of the coolest things about Ancestry that I think is a not widely known secret, and that is that if you click on the name of a record collection, it will actually open a search form that just searches that collection. So how convenient is that? So I clicked on this collection and got this search form, and then what I wanted to do, I wanted to find his siblings, but I can't search by their names because I don't know them. So I put in the last name of Hudson, and then I put in what I assumed to be a reasonable span based on information that I had. Like, so when did I think that that couple was probably having children? Excuse me. And so the range that I chose on Ancestry, you have to specify a range like 10 years before or 10 years after, 2 years before, 2 years after. So you kind of choose a mid-range of your, or a mid-year of your range, and then choose whatever you want, plus or minus X amount of years. And so I made a 20-year range here with plus or minus 10 years on either side of 1905. And then I put in the dad's name, full name, and the mother's first name, because again, on most English parish registers, the mother's surname is not listed. And lo and behold, look what came up in the search results. We've got Joe, which we were expecting to find. He would fall within that range, but we've got a William and a Frank and a Harry. Now, William is born in the same place, but and the names are right, but Fred and Jane are not exactly uncommon. And there's a little bit of an age gap here, right? From 99 to '06. So is this really my family? And then we've got the later kids being christened in a different location. So that's another thing. Can I be confident that these are really my people? So you never want to just rely on this information without trying to corroborate it with other records or with at least the images. And in this case, we ended up using both. So here are the images of all of these kids put in order. So we've got Joe. He turns out to be the oldest child that we've found at this point, and the family is living on 10 Elm Street. Well, William, even though that's 7 years later, they're living on 10 Elm Street as well, and the dad's occupation, cotton operative, is the same. So I feel very, very confident that William belongs in this family. What about the other kids? Different location here and a different occupation. Well, what we were able to do is verify this information with the census. So this, excuse me just a second. Thank you. So this information, the address matches the address on the 1901 census where I had already found the family. Or wait, no, I hadn't already found the family, but then I found the census and saw that it matched. And so then I felt very comfortable that the family in the census was the same family I was looking at in these christening records. Well, then, oh, sorry, you guys, I'm like totally losing my voice. There we go. I got a little tickle in my throat. So this one doesn't match the other two kids, but what it does match is the 1911 census for this family. And the 1911 census matches the 1901. So it was very clear that all these records, when we looked at the information, there was consistency between the records. And so we could be confident that all four of these children belonged in the same family. So the other three that we found really were Joe's siblings. Okay, last example is of verifying a marriage. This one is for Ivy Mae Heading. So I found her marriage, and then I wanted to be sure that this Ivy Mae that I had found in the 1911 census was the same as the one that I found getting married. So let's take a look at the census. In this census, Ivy is 9 years old. And her dad is George William Heading, kind of a unique name, which is good. But look at the occupation. I have to admit, that was like, I think, the first and only time that I've ever seen this occupation. He is a potato salesman. How cool is that? I don't know if he had roots in Ireland or something because they were famous for their potatoes, but this would just make him so easy to trace. So let's take a look at the marriage record. Ivy Mae Heading, George William Heading, potato salesman. And I have to say, the first time I was working on this with a friend who were a stake member or something. We were working together. And the first time I saw this, I'm all whatever. Okay, I guess he's like a collate salesman, some kind of paper salesman or something. I had no clue. And then after we found the census, my friend and I went back to this. We're like, oh, that has to say potato. And so that actually, finding it in the 1911 helped us read it on the marriage record. But again, comparing the two records let us be very confident that the Ivy Mae in the census record is the same woman who is later marrying Victor John Waddingham. Okay, last thing. Actually, I said the examples were last. I apologize. Now we have two more slides for the last thing, and then we'll open it up for question. So where do you find these amazing English church records? Well, they are on the Family Search, the major Family Search partners. So on Family Search itself, of course, which is not a partner, but Family Search Historical Records, Ancestry, Find My Past, wonderful for English records. In fact, I have multiple times found images on Find My Past that I was not able to find anyplace else. So for English research, definitely check out Find My Past. And MyHeritage also has English church records. But that's not all. There are also specialty sites. So not any of the big partners, but just other independent websites. We've already talked about Free Reg, which is run completely by volunteers and it's free to use. Another favorite site of mine for English records is the Online Parish Clerk. And to my knowledge, they have that for either most or all counties in England. I haven't checked to see if they have it for all, but I've never tried to look for a county that they didn't have. So I think it's very likely that they cover all counties. And they've got, again, run by volunteers, totally free. They've got a great search form. You just look and search for your records. And I found information there that I haven't been able to find other places. These other two I listed because I became aware of them, but honestly, I haven't used them. So I can't speak, or used them very much, I should say. So I can't speak from a lot of experience, but I wanted to at least make you aware of them in case they come in handy for you. So Parish Mouse and Dusty Docs. Two more resources that I lied. I'm so sorry. I thought I had two slides. Now I see I had three on the on where to find these records. The Family Search Wiki is an amazing resource. It's, as probably a lot of you know, it's not a place to find people, but it's a place to find information about research and what records are available in a certain locality. So for instance, if I was searching in Warwickshire, England, I would go to the wiki, I would put in Warwickshire, England, and then I would get a page that would give me all kinds of links to records for Warwickshire, England, including church records. So checking out the wiki is a great thing. And then also microfilm. I know this is the 21st century, but everything has not been digitized yet to my knowledge, and definitely everything hasn't been indexed yet. So there are times that I've only been able to find things on microfilm. Now you're probably aware that Salt Lake no longer loans microfilms out. So my understanding is you can't go to a family history center and request for Salt Lake to send you a film. But you can go to Salt Lake. I understand that even in the pandemic, I was told by a friend that she was able to make an appointment to go in the library. And so if I don't know that from personal information, but I'm sure if you contacted the library, they could tell you the protocols around that, whether you make an appointment or whatever it is. And then also the BYU Family History Library and the Riverton Library, Riverton, Utah Library out by the Ochre Mountain Temple have microfilm collections. So they're not complete, but especially I've noticed Riverton has a lot of English records. And I don't know about, I know I've found English records at the BYU Family History Library, English microfilms, but I'm not sure how complete that collection is. The thing that is great is that all of these libraries, they've got a way to search for whether the microfilm is available at that library. In fact, you know what, you guys, now that I say that, so BYU has, or at least had, its own little website where you could search for a microfilm number and find out if the BYU library has it. But I just remembered that if you go to the Family Search catalog and look up the film number, it will tell you what libraries have a copy of that film. And so I've often seen them at Riverton and BYU, like I said, but also sometimes I've seen that that film is, for instance, at the Los Angeles Family History Library or another major library in another state. So definitely, if you want to know where these microfilms are, like you look it up and you say, oh, film 1732968 has my ancestor on it. I've got to get a copy of that film. Go to the Family Search catalog, look it up, look up the film number, and then look at the drop down on the page that shows you where that film is available. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our class tonight. Just by way of summary, we went over the key dates for English church records. We gave examples of the records and what you can expect as far as printed forms, handwritten forms, format, and so forth. We walked through several research examples and then talked about where you can find these records. So thank you, everybody. I know there's so many things that you could be doing on a Tuesday night, and I'm grateful that you chose to spend your time with us. And we'll open it up for questions. And Christy, I guess, do I turn that back over to you? Do you moderate the questions usually for these classes, or how would you like to work that?
So anyone can just go ahead and ask a question. And yes, you will just answer it directly.
Okay, so they can unmute and just ask the question.
Yeah, they should
Cool.
be able to mute.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, Catherine, I do have a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the 1837 and beyond, you know, the civil registration records.
Yeah.
Is the best way to get copies of those records, is it the best way to go to the website, the General Register Office?
Yeah.
Is that how you get those?
Yeah, that's definitely been my experience that the best way is to go to the GRO site. So General Register Office site, as you said. One reason that I go to that site is that when I've tried to order civil registration on other sites, I don't want to diss anybody, but I will tell you that I went to a popular website. They wanted like $38 to order this thing. So like almost $40 to order a civil registration. If you go to the GRO site, last time I ordered a birth certificate, for one thing, you can get PDFs direct from the GRO site and they come in 5 working days. And last time I ordered a birth or a burial, it cost me, I want to say £9, which ended up being at the current exchange rate about $14. The exchange rate at the time was about $14. So that's way better than 38. So I would always go directly to the GRO site and not to another site who acts as an intermediary, because they're going to charge you, they're going to get their cut. So great question.
Yeah. So I guess for people who don't know, so that index that you get like on Ancestry or even on Family Search, doesn't it come with like the volume number?
Oh, it does. Would you like to take a look at that really quickly? Would that be helpful or not so much?
Sure, that would be fun.
How are we on time? Oh, we're past time.
We're
Never
yeah,
mind.
we're a little bit past time,
Yeah,
but
we are. Never mind then. If anyone wants to stay on, I can do it. But otherwise, I was just trying to think. Just, yeah, if you look up the record, pretty much any site that you look up civil registration on, it will give you a volume and page number. And then when you go to the GRO site, you use that information to order the certificate.
okay, that's really helpful.
Thank you. Thanks for asking the question.
Yeah, no problem. Any more questions from anyone? So
yeah.
reading that. Okay.
You see the comment?
Yes.
Yeah, G Hammer noted that, yeah, the GRO gives the mother's maiden name, which is huge. But guess what? I just recently, like seriously, within the past 2 weeks, I think it was, discovered that Find My Past also includes the mother's maiden name. And it was so if for any of you who use FreeBMD, that is a great site for civil registration, but they don't give the mother's maiden name until I want to say 1913. Can anybody correct me on that? I think it's about 1913 when FreeBMD includes the mother's maiden name. But before that time, you either go to the GRO site or, as I said, I noticed that Find My Past started including it too. I'm not sure of the time frame on Find My Past. I do know that the record I looked at was well before 1913, but I'm not sure if they go back to the beginning of civil registration or if it's just partial. But yeah, if you're using Find My Past, watch for that.
I discovered that as well. And
Yeah.
Wow, this is great because Ancestry and Family Search, they won't give you that little bit of information, but Find My Past will give you that maiden name, which is so helpful to know that's your ancestor.
Incredibly helpful. I agree.
Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much.
Oh, do you know what? I just forgot, Christy. I promised to put in the link to the slide deck. I'm so
Oh,
sorry. Let me do that really quickly.
sure, no
Get out
problem.
of here. And then that way, if people have questions or they want to follow some of those links, they're able to do it. And you know what, too, everybody, people always ask me, like, okay, if you put the link in the chat, then how do I access it or how do I save it or whatever? So let me just go ahead and throw this in the chat, which I just lost when there we go. Got to get it back. Okay, so there's the link, you guys. And if you click this link, it is going to open it in your browser, and then you can mark, like, depending on the browser you're using, you can click favorite or bookmark or whatever your browser calls it. But then that lets you save the URL and you can get to it again if you need to. So thanks, Christy. Sorry about that.
Sure, yeah, no problem. I tried to just click on it and it said it was to your slide presentation and that it's locked.
Oh, no.
Maybe that's not.
Let me see if I have not shared it. That would not be good. Let's go back here, because if I haven't shared it, then that's actually easy to fix.
Okay.
Let me see, I got to move the Zoom thing out of the way. It's blocking my way. Those of you who have presented on Zoom know how that goes. Oh my goodness, yes. Well, wait, it says only people, yeah, only people added. I didn't do it to anyone with the link. So
Okay.
this is now fixed, you guys, and you should be able to see it. Thank you so much, Christy, for letting me know that I had not made the permissions correct.
Oh, no problem. I just thought I would test it out.
Yeah.
I think that should work now. So, okay.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
So happy you have a wealth of knowledge, and I've just been taking notes. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
And so once again, I just want to reiterate that this is being recorded. So you can go back to it just by going to the website, the Granite Family History website. You'll be able to see it under classes or past classes. And I also want to let you know about the upcoming Tuesday class. So next week we will have Furthering Your Family History Research with DNA Testing, and it will be taught by Debbie Weaver. So that she is an expert on DNA. So I recommend you attending that class. And thank you again.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
You too.